All right, ladies and gentlemen. So in our last presentation, we talked about what evolution is and how evolution relates to DNA, to your traits, to mutation. And we talked about how evolution is basically the process of deciding which traits are good and which traits are bad. In fact, we end up calling this process natural selection. We call it natural selection because what's happening is nature, specifically the environment that the organism lives in, and we talked about what that is in the last podcast. Natural selection is basically saying that nature or the environment is deciding which traits are good, which traits are bad, and which traits are neutral. And because of that, when nature makes that decision, it is selecting organisms to be superior in that environment. And that causes those organisms to become more common. So this, of course, begs the question, how do we know this? And like any science, it's because we have evidence. But this particular thing started with a very famous scientist by the name of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, we'll learn a little bit more about him in a couple of weeks, but Charles Darwin was a naturalist, a scientist studying nature, who traveled the world with the British Navy. And while he was doing that, he stumbled upon organisms, specifically finches, which is a type of bird on the Galapagos Islands. And he studied numerous organisms. He's just most famous for the finches. And what he noticed was that all the finches on all these different islands had different beaks, and that these beaks gave the finches advantages in terms of how they were able to find food. And each of the finches found different types of food based upon what else was on the island with him. And it was a very simple observation, but it was a powerful one because it let him realize that there's a relationship between the traits that organisms have and the environment that they are in. So what Charles Darwin realized is that over huge amounts of time, millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, organisms change. And as they change, gradually they become new organisms. And as new organisms arise because of these changes, many older organisms cease to exist. And that's how new organisms come to be, and that's how older organisms that no longer exist vanish, because they are no longer selected for by nature. So, of course, like any scientific process, we have to have evidence. And the evidence for this comes in many ways. Number one piece of evidence, and I think this is really important, is the DNA similarities. At this point in our stage in biology, the relationship between DNA is the most important. We also have morphological similarities, which is things like what we call homologous structures, which hopefully you remember homologous means same, or rather homo means same, so homologous means structures that are similar. There's also what we call comparative embryology. And also something called vestigial structures. And so naturally we're going to talk about each of these in turn. So let's start with homologous structures. So if you take a look at this image, you find several different organisms. You find a turtle, an alligator, a bird, and a mammal. And this mammal looks like something like a cat or a rodent of some sort. And down here what you have is an ancient fish, a fish that probably doesn't even exist anymore. And what you'll notice is color-coded in each diagram are bones. And each color bone that's the same. So for instance, you can see in the mammal, there's this bone that's colored yellow, whereas in the bird, it's that bone. In the alligator, it's this bone. And in the turtle, it's this bone. Well, those bones are all similar. The idea is that they all changed over time from that bone in the ancient lobe fish. And as they changed, some of those changes led the organism down the path to becoming a turtle. Some of those changes led the organisms down the path to becoming a mammal. And there are many organisms along the way, but what's left for us is mammals and some fish and some turtles and some alligators. And when we look at their skeletons and other parts of their body, what we see are structures that are similar in both that organism and similar organisms, but also, as you can see from this diagram, in organisms that are not really similar at all. And that's evidence for evolution, because there are similarities in organisms that on the surface seem to be unrelated. Another good example is something called vestigial structures. Now, vestigial structures are structures that no longer serve a purpose. So vestigial structures are structures that no longer serve a purpose. And you can see on the human there's a number of examples. Wisdom teeth, all of us just have them taken out. They actually are no good for us because the general structure of our jaw isn't big enough to hold them. And that's for a lot of reasons. The size of your jaw, the structure of it has changed over time as your brain case has gotten bigger. Also, you no longer use those teeth because your diet is no longer as heavy in plants, which those teeth are used to grind. You have things like your appendix, which is the most common example, and it's a piece of your intestines that we think used to be used to cultivate the bacteria that you need in your intestines to digest food. But now, because we are so densely populated throughout the earth, you get to interact with so many people so frequently that you're constantly exposed to that bacteria, and you don't need to have basically a culture of mold growing inside your intestines anymore. Body hair generally has no purpose. At this point, it's simply decoration. The coccyx, which is your tailbone, actually literally used to be the bones of your tail. But you don't have a tail anymore because you walk upright. You don't need it to balance yourself. So those are just some examples you could find within yourself. Now, the other picture, which you can see right here, is the tail section of a whale. And what you'll notice is that inside the whale, and we found this by dissecting them, there are bones that are a pelvis and a femur. Now, your femur is your upper leg bone, all right? Well, whales don't have back legs. So why would a whale have that? And that's what we call a vestigial structure. It's a structure that there's still pieces of it left in the organism, and they no longer serve a purpose. So you may ask yourself, why is this evidence for evolution? Well, think about it. If there's a structure in the organism that no longer serves a purpose, at some point the organism was different. And when it was different, that structure did serve a purpose. For instance, this pelvis and femur in a whale, whales used to be wolves, basically. And so at one point, they were a lot like dogs. They had 4 legs, they ran around on the land, and they started hunting in the water. That's where all their prey was. They started to lose their hair, their nose changed position. Eventually, they end up being whales. Human beings, we used to be similar to primates. So when you take something like the coccyx, the reason you have a tailbone is because at some point, one of your ancestors used to have a tail. And we don't have one anymore, but at some point we did. And so as those changes accumulated over time, you can't get rid of everything because evolution does not make a perfect solution. It simply changes what is already there. And sometimes those changes are imperfect, and that leads to things like vestigial structures. Another piece of evidence that we have for evolution is something called comparative embryology. Now, I'll be honest with you, this is, while interesting and useful to look at, what this mostly is another example of homologous structures. So we talked about how when sexually reproducing organisms reproduce, you take the sperm from the father and the egg from the mother, and they fuse. When they fuse, they create a zygote. That zygote then undergoes mitosis. And as that mitosis happens, the cells begin to grow in number, and they also begin to change and become different types. That's when things like your skin cells start to form, or your heart cells, or your brain cells, or your muscle cells. And what that does is that creates visual stages in an embryo. And you can see in this diagram, right here, these are some stages in the embryo of a fish. Right here, these are some stages in the embryo of a pig. Right here, these are some stages in the embryo of a rabbit. And the last one here, some stages in the embryo of a human. Now, these stages are at relatively similar points, depending on the amount of time it takes for the organism to develop before it's fully functioning. But it's not hard to look at this and see the similarities. And again, just like when you look at similarities in anatomy or similarities in vestigial structures, the more similarities there are, the more likely the organisms are closely related. Now, all of these things were terrific evidence in Darwin's time, and they were actually a big deal in the developing of the theory of evolution. But now we have the ultimate piece of evidence, evidence that transcends everything else and in fact explains all of these pieces of evidence. And that final evidence is DNA. So what I have here, it says amino acid sequence in primates. So this is the amino acid sequence for a protein. So hopefully you remember, because we've said it many a times, your DNA gives you your amino acid sequence. Your amino acid sequence gives you your protein structure. We've talked about how structure equals function. So that means that the amino acid sequence gives us our protein function, and our protein function is our traits. So over here I have an amino acid sequence. That means that is the structure of a protein in primates. That means that that came from DNA in those primates. And so let's take a look. Compare, let's say, the human being to the lemur. If you look at everywhere I've circled red, there are differences between the two of them. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 differences between a human being and a lemur. Okay? Between a human being and a gorilla, 0. Between a human being and a chimp, 0. Between a human being and a baboon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5. Which organism would you think that the human being is most closely related to? It's kind of a trick. There's 2 answers. But which organism do you think human beings are least closely related to? And see, that's the beauty. What we can do with modern technology is examine the DNA of different organisms. And what it basically boils down to is the less differences there are in between the DNA of 2 different organisms, the more closely related they are. Just think about this. Every single organism on the planet, every single one, the bacteria that can give you strep throat, the E. coli that live inside your intestines and help you digest food, your pet dog, your pet cat, the fish that you see in the fish tank, birds that fly through the sky, you, your parents, every single organism on this planet uses the same exact process to decode its DNA. So how we talked about, you take the DNA, you convert it to mRNA, and then you take that mRNA and you look at that codon chart, and the tRNA bring over the appropriate amino acid. Every single organism on the planet does that. The only way that that makes sense is if we all came from one single common ancestor. One organism in the very beginnings of life on this earth. One single cell in the oceans of primitive earth became other cells. And then they changed over time. Their DNA changed, which gave them new proteins, which gave them new traits. Then they started to work together, and all of a sudden you have multiple cells. And then over time you have fish, and then from fish you have lizards, and frogs, and turtles. And then you have small furry mammals, and then you have large mammals, and then you have primates, and then you have human beings. And that is the theory of evolution.